right.
we okay though?
Sorry, what? Are you making a
No.
joke that I can't record? Okay, so everybody, we are very honored today to have Anuj Gupta. Did I say that right?
You did. Thanks so much for
Yeah.
having me, Heidi.
I met him this summer at Computers and Writing, and he is in the graduate program at the University of Arizona, which is a amazing program. And he's doing research on AI. And because our research methods class is focused on AI, I thought that would be the perfect combination to talk about not only what AI is and how we look at it, but how you can research AI. So I had something else I was going to say. There are two articles. You had two articles out this year, right? Like the computers
Yes.
and writing, computers and composition,
Mhm.
and the open praxis article. So yeah, this is all very recent. I think last week we sent out the message that the computers and composition one was out, and that's what prompted me to do
Nice.
this little lesson. But so we're just going to talk in general about information relating kind of to your chapter 7 reading this week. Um,
Hmm.
so intro, methods, research, and discussion are kind of the core organizational structure for research articles. And one of the things I want to talk about with you is um, why did you, I mean, how did you decide to do the headings you did? Why did you break it down further? What was the reading strategy behind that for this Parrots article?
Uh, the logic behind the subheadings?
Yeah, just like what, as you were writing it up for your audience, you know, you have introduction and literature, but how did you decide where to break it or where to add in to chunk it out into different sections?
That's a great question. I think because I'm a user experience person myself, I always like to make content that's skimmable, that's easy to follow. So that was playing on a lot of my mind. But as you can see, that both these papers, especially the open praxis one, is a collaborative one where I worked with 4 people. I worked with 2 colleagues from Egypt, Yasser Atif and Mahabali, and Anna Mills from the US. And everyone was kind of bringing different ideas about how to structure and how to think about things. And Yasser, especially, also has a lot of expertise in disability studies. So he was able to give a lot of input about like what tables are accessible and what are not. So I guess I was very conscious of the fact that people are going to access the article, most of them, in an online environment where there'll be lots of other tabs open. And in all likelihood, not everyone reads it like people might read it in a research methods class, like very thoughtfully and
Mm.
carefully. So it's to make it skimmable. Uh, the headlines, the subheadings are meant to convey as much of the argument as possible, um, just to get a basic skeleton, a structure of just where our argument is headed. So I would say that ideally, sections in a research article generally follow the schema of IMRD that you've already spoken about. At least empirical research follows that to a lot. But within that structure of introduction, methods, results, and discussion, the kind of subheadings that we choose and how we slant them, what we do with them, I personally like it if it's A, very skimmable, and B, helps the reader follow the argument along so that even if somebody just reads the subheadings, they can get a kind of TLDR summary of where the authors are going up with this.
That's an excellent thing that you mentioned because one of the details I noticed about your writing is that you're very good at signposting and directing the reader along the way between the sections.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm going to talk about one example of that in your introduction. Where am I at? I went too far. Just this whole paragraph right here is
Mhm.
is setting up this. Here's what we're going to do. It doesn't read that way. You're
Right.
not saying like this is what we're going to write directly, but you're writing these things as a means for the audience to get the overview of the article. So my question about this is, and you might not remember the answer to this, but when did you write that in the scope of writing the article? Did you write it first, last? What? When did you draft the signpost, the transitional part?
That's a good question. So I think one reason why the signposting happened kind of organically is because four different people were working on different sections and sometimes on the same section together. So the signposting was really important in a team writing so that we could follow what the other person was doing. So tentatively, like whenever we'd write a section out, I think we'd write some sort of a note about like, hey, this is what I'm doing here, and this is where the next section can pick up from. But the actual signposting that you see in the final stuff, I think it happened more towards the end, especially the signposting for the introduction, because it's only after we had done the research that we knew that, okay, this is what we are kind of offering to our readers. How I think we started off was with initial signposting was just with the research questions and some rough ideas about what we are trying to, like, basically a big takeaway. Like I've always learned that in the introduction, you should have a hook where your readers can find out like this is what I'll get after reading this, so that they can decide whether it's worth their time to read further or not. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess a little bit of skeletal outlining happened at the beginning, but the actual fleshing out of the signposts happened towards the end.
Okay. And that's a good point. Like you're in several papers, several places in the paper, you go back to that kind of signposting. It's not that you have this chunk at the beginning and then everything else is just description. You keep circling back up to that main point in each section, um,
Mhm.
so that your reader can go along with you. And that's one of the important things about understanding when you're reading this research, that
Mhm.
you can use those cues. Like when I was skimming, in my PhD program, 200 articles a week or whatever we had to do, I had a method, and it was basically reading headings and reading the last sentences of paragraph. That was the first pass. And then the second pass would be, going through, because I wanted that, okay, here's what you're doing. And of course, the abstract also does that. So,
Now
um,
that you mentioned, I've seen a lot of research in applied linguistics. For example, Charles Bazerman, done a historical study of how the research article in science journals evolved over like hundreds of years. And I think he makes the argument that these kind of linguistic rhetorical structures, like you said, topic sentences or bookends of paragraphs, and those kinds of signpostings were actually, they emerged to allow this kind of skimming for researchers, because if you have to process a lot of research in a short amount of time, that's what you need. You need those signposts to identify which are the papers that you'll go deep into and which are the papers that you'll just do a bird's eye view of.
yes, that's perfect. That's well said. Because that's what I think, especially with our grad students, when they get to their upper division or their 7,000 level theory courses, the reading's overwhelming. And so
Yeah.
I always say, you're not meant to read it like you read a novel. You're meant to read it like you're a researcher. And so this is where we're kind of learning to read like a researcher.
I like that
Um,
distinction. Yeah.
yeah. And so the next question I had was just the process of your methodology. So you have these research questions that you're guided by. Did you start with those questions before you gathered the data, or were those questions that emerged out of the data?
I love that question. So for me, research is always a very embodied, organic process that comes out of my life and what I observe around me. So it happened in two ways. One was I was really observing stuff around me in happening about AI and Chat GPT, the kind of social media discussions that were happening. Still am. I'm very interested in that. And I kept on noticing like there are these metaphors that people keep on directly or indirectly talking about or using. And also in my past experiences as an English teacher, I had been very fascinated with the concept of metaphors. I'd used it in a few research projects before. And I think the real crystallization of this for me was when I presented an introduction to LLMs for my writing program, where I used five different metaphors through which we can think about it. So it was a little presentation for writing teachers in first year writing at my university. Simultaneously, I saw an article by Mahabali, who's a scholar in critical AI literacy who I really respect, where she had also written a blog about a few metaphors about AI that she had seen. I think her mother had told her something about AI is like a cake or something like that, that Sometimes you buy cakes from the market if you want to host a birthday party or something. So sometimes it might be okay to use AI to produce writing, but sometimes when you want it to be special, you bake a cake at home because you want to have a personalized, subjective experience. And that's why sometimes writing should not use AI. So I read that blog post and then I reached out to her on Twitter. And I knew Anna Mills as another person who I'd seen on Twitter. Honestly, these are not people that I knew from before.
Mm-hmm.
So I reached out to them on Twitter, and I think I had met at the CES conference. And we just started chatting about. I said, "Hey, I'm feeling like I want to write something about metaphors, and I've seen that you guys are also interested about this. What do you say we get on a Zoom call and think about any ideas that we have?" And the methodology that you see that's finally in the paper gradually emerged from these discussions. The specific method that we use is we call it a collaborative auto ethnography. And collaborative essentially means that more than one person worked on it together. The notion of ethnography to me means that you try and embed yourself within a certain community, within a certain kind of social environment, and try and grasp the different subjective meanings that people have, the different beliefs, the different ideas, largely using qualitative means. And auto ethnography means doing this for your own self or for your own community. So basically, what we realized during those discussions between the four of us is that we were talking a lot about the metaphors we are seeing. So through that discussion, we started making a list of, hey, here are the metaphors that I've seen, here are the metaphors that I've seen. How does that make sense? What's happening there? And then I think Maha was the person who thought about like, hey, maybe this could be a collaborative autoethnography where our discussions are the data itself, our own life experiences are the data, and we produce some findings based on that.
Excellent. So yeah, so what you're saying is that you didn't say, like here are some research questions. I'm going to go find some research and then I'm going to replicate that research and then I'm going to talk about it. You kind of went
No.
along with your co-authors to kind of decide here's the methodology that will be best based on these questions that we have. And then we
Yeah.
need to, because writing the questions out, that's as you guys get to your thesis project, um, is
Like, I
hard.
think
I think it's a hard part for students to nail those questions down.
it happens eventually, and I'm a big fan of templates and just kind of looking at what are the different ways in which people write questions. But I usually begin with something that interests me or a curiosity in the world. Like in this case, it was, people are using metaphors. What does that mean? How is that happening? Where can this take me? And then dialogically in the discussions between me and my co-authors, these questions kind of emerged. I think we started off with the first question, which was pretty easy to come to: how are metaphors and public discourse on AI shaping our understanding and behavior towards these systems? Because that is the curiosity that had gotten us interesting. And the second bit, what implications it has for kind of attitudes towards AI and those kinds of things, that eventually emerged from our discussions. And an exercise that I really like to do is just to think through what um, data possibilities, what interpretive possibilities different question types open up. So, for example, what questions usually help in descriptive kind of research studies where you're just trying to find out what exists, whereas how questions try to explore potential connections or processes or issues of causality, like how is this happening, mechanisms instead of just what is out there. And then why questions probe further and try to kind of make claims about uh, causality between factors which can be established with a high degree of confidence. And yeah, so just thinking about what interpretive possibilities different questions open up, and using samples from the research papers that you're seeing as templates and then trying to
Mm-hmm.
fit in what you're curious about into them might be a helpful thing for your students.
Yes. So the next question I have is a one you might not remember. So you do a really good job of integrating a lot of different research here. Like I can see 3 or 4 themes throughout, like what's one with Felber's work in it. I love Felber. Yes. So Felber
Yeah.
is a that's one framework. And then you're talking about metaphor, and that's another framework. And then you're talking about the artifacts themselves, and that's another framework. And you do a really good job in this article of walking the reader through all of that. So to me, at least, and maybe because I do Selber in my dissertation, it wasn't overwhelming. It was
Yeah.
it was really, it was laid out nicely. So when you're writing up based on research, some of the things, if you notice, students, I'm talking to you, are cited sources where you cite from the source.
Yeah.
And some of the sources are, let me get to where I'm at here.
Just paraphrased or listed as a list that here are
Right.
people who've done so.
And so, and we work on in the proposal class, they do an annotated bibliography. And so the thing I'm interested in is, I know it's probably not a conscious thought as you're writing, but when do you decide, yes, this is important enough to quote? And when do you say, these things are important, but just as references to show I know this, but I'm not going to get into it?
I love that. I think you kind of answered the question in the initial Selber idea. Basically, how it works for me is that a lit review it starts off by trying to be comprehensive, by trying to include as many things as I can, which have been said about the things that I'm trying to say. And obviously, it's humanly impossible to include everything, but you still try and do a wide grasp, and you try and use as many different kinds of databases as you can. So I often start off with Google Scholar, but then I also don't depend entirely on it, because these research engines are also driven by algorithms, different kinds of AI algorithms, but they're also AI. So they have their own kinds of biases. So I use my libraries search engine. I use Google Scholar. I use stuff that I'm seeing on social media that people post, papers or other things. I will search through WAC Clearinghouse for writing related things. So just as wide a net as I can cast to find things that hit my keywords. And here, obviously, it was also helpful to have various colleagues who had various kinds of disciplinary expertise, could bring in their kind of resources. And through that process of just marinating or gestating in these wide range of sources, slowly, I think some sources start to become like, these are kind of creating a path of argumentation that I can borrow from, I can build on, I can extend. So those get quoted rather than just cited or paraphrased. And from within the quoted ones, I think eventually one or two become ones that could potentially be used as a theoretical framework, a larger kind of umbrella, which would be the frame in which the results of the study could be interpreted, which in this case was Selber's framework. And those theoretical frameworks for me are usually the ones that have the most flexible and most wide encompassing kind of interpretive possibilities. And both the concept of how metaphors shape our psychology, shape our thoughts and behavior, and Selber's idea of digital literacies as being functional, rhetorical, critical, those felt like those could offer wide range of possibilities. And our intervention, I think, was synthesizing these two notions and presenting a framework for critical AI literacy using them.
So you're the first group of people who put those two frameworks in juxtaposition with the topic of AI.
I would like to believe so, and I think so, but like, who knows? Like, maybe there are people who have used it after us, and they cite us as like some of the people that inspired them to do it. But
Mm-hmm.
like, often research flows in these complex, decentralized ways. So I wouldn't be surprised if somebody else has also thought of the same idea parallel to us. But I would like to believe, without too much vanity, yeah, maybe we were the ones who came up with the idea.
Well, and not because like, oh, you're the best, you obviously came up with this first, but because sometimes what I see students run into, and I would run into this, is I come up with this question that was just amazing. Like I was so brilliant in coming up with this question. And then I would search, and like 3 people had already written about that. And I'd be like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, I have no idea what I'm doing. Like I thought that was, so part of research is establishing that background, that you know what you're doing. It's an ethos, it's the ethos signaling with your reader. And also that you I probably lost the second half of that thought. That you know what you've done hasn't been immediately done before unless you are replicating a particular study. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk about go ahead.
Just to add a brief thought, like it's, as I said, humanly impossible to know everything. So even if you do a wide search and you don't find anybody who's done this thing that you are doing, it's still possible that somebody might have, you just haven't found it, especially because a lot of research does not get published in English journals and the Western world doesn't have access to them. So what can be helpful in those situations is just to hedge your claims a little bit, just to add phrases like, to the best of our knowledge, we do not think that this method or this approach has been used so far, just to give your readers a little more honesty about the confidence with which you're advancing, the uniqueness or innovativeness of your work.
Well, that's good to say, because with the land, like research isn't a thing, it's many things. Yeah. And I think one interpretation of research is novelty. And so you're not necessarily, you're not, unless I know something else, you don't, or unless you know something I don't know, like we're not winning the Nobel Prize here, right? We're just contributing pieces to this big puzzle. So,
yeah.
All right. So with that said, I would like to talk about your process of data collection.
Right.
So what you talk about it here, kind of how you do it and what the methodology is. And so my specific question was kind of like those questions at the beginning. Did your data analysis categories and questions come out of the data, or were they things that you're like, I want to know about these things?
For me, it's always a dialogic process of just engaging with the data. So the first question of like, how did we collect the data? I'm a big fan of mixed methods research. I'm a big fan of like, I'm not one of those people who's like only quantitative or only qualitative. I feel like all disciplines, all kinds of methods have something to offer. So in fact, the 3 articles that you talked about, you can see a wide range of methods. This one uses a purely qualitative method. The computers and composition article uses a largely quantitative but also qualitative method. The Translingual article uses actually a design thinking, intervention, action research kind of thing, which some people wouldn't even call research perhaps, but in the humanities, we have the space to kind of call that also as research. So where I like to begin is, or at least where I began, was to first introduce myself to as many different methods that are out there, see what kind of possibilities they open up. And I don't have to be an expert in any of them. Like as a technical communicator, I think all I need to do is just to understand the basics of what these methods can do, what kind of claims can be advanced using them. For example, if you aren't doing like a randomized controlled trial, using kind of random sampling and things, then it's very difficult to advance claims of concrete causality, like X causes Y. So if you're using quantitative analysis, you should know that perhaps those are not the kind of claims that you should be advancing. That doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just that different methods offer different possibilities. So for this particular one, the data collection method, I think, emerged organically, as I said, between our discussions. In our initial meeting, we started talking about the different metaphors that we were seeing. And I don't know who it was, but we had the idea to start noting it down on an Excel sheet. And honestly, MS Excel is one of the most powerful and undervalued research tools out there. There's so many powerful things that we can do. Of course, there are fancy tools too. But on MS Excel, in one column, we started noting down all the metaphors that we had heard in our surroundings, all 4 of us. And we had that list. And then we started talking about what those metaphors about AI mean to us, or what do we think is happening to people who might be accessing AI through the filter of that metaphor. Like, let's say if somebody's first introduction to Chat GPT is through, hey, this is just a friendly assistant, why don't you use it? Versus if somebody is accessing it through Emily Bender's paper, where she's saying that, hey, this is just a mimicking parrot, or you're accessing it through Owusu Ansa's paper, who kind of implies that this is a colonizing loudspeaker, its voice is drowning other people out. So we had these discussions about what each of those metaphors were doing to our own thoughts and what we thought it could be doing to other people's thoughts. And that's where these questions started to emerge, like, okay, what feelings are these metaphors arousing in us? How does
Mhm.
it help us understand AI? What kind of perspective is it pushing the listener? And those questions then became new columns on our Excel sheet. And then each row was basically a metaphor. And then we try and answer each of those column questions for each metaphor. So, for example, the parrot metaphor, what kind of feeling is it evoking? How is
Mhm.
it helping us understand for each of those metaphors? And on the Excel sheet, we had 4 tabs where each of us filled out our sheets independently after several meetings. And once that happened, then we met and we started synthesizing the results to create one composite table where we could all align and feel like, okay, yeah, this is what we feel about this metaphor. This is what we feel about this metaphor. And then is when we had the idea to, if you go above a little bit to the graph, that's when we had the idea that okay, we have this table, we have all the metaphors in the rows, and we have these 6 questions and their analysis, but this is too much data. If we give this, then people probably won't be able to understand. So research is also about synthesizing and creating more and more abstractions and patterns to make it easy for people to comprehend and derive meaning. And that's when, kind of through our discussions itself, this idea of that, hey, maybe we can plot these metaphors along 2 dimensions. We can collapse the 6 questions into 2 larger dimensions. One dimension drawing directly from Selber's work, the 3 kinds of literacies that he talks about on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, like what kind of ontological status does the metaphor have? Is it human? Is it semi-human? Is it non-human? And we tried out different dimensions. It's not like this suddenly came to us one day as a eureka moment, but once we came up with dimensions where all our metaphors could fit, then in future meetings, we sat down, took our collective Excel sheets, and started plotting each metaphor where it would fall on this. And yeah, that's how it started. The picture started to emerge and the analysis started to lead us to insights. And all of this you can't pre-plan. Like, it's not something you decide from the beginning. It happens through the process itself. So yeah, sorry for the long description, but that's kind of like what we did for data collection and analysis.
And that's good because we don't obviously in 14 weeks have time to go through and do the research and write up for our students, they pretty much do this over 2 or 3 semesters. But this is what you're talking about is that they put a lot of pressure on themselves at the beginning to say, I need this proposal. It needs to be good. We have to defend it. But really, what most researchers do, unless you're literally in a lab with and even then, probably some of this happens, is you're developing and analyzing, and your situation changes as you find new information. And so to say, I'm going to do this at the beginning, here's my research, here's my discussion, is not really how that's not really how research works. It looks like it because in these final, beautiful, glossy articles, we're like, wow, these people are genius. I could never do this. But really, it's a process. And coming down to this one graph is amazing. Like, because even when you're talking, I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, like all these things are popping in my head. But this really, I can look at this and say, okay, this is what they mean by functional, critical, rhetorical. This is what they mean by
Yeah.
yeah, so it's boiling down, but it's a process in which those kinds of visuals kind of come out of your research.
Yep.
I want to be
And
mindful
this
of your
table
time.
here, as technical communicators, this might be interesting for your students to learn. And thanks to Yasser, who helped us realize this, that data visualizations are not always very accessible to people who use screen readers or who can't see texts. So it's important to include versions of your data visualizations or analysis that would be readable. So that's why we included this table.
So this is I'm assuming like a
Kind of like a
JPEG.
data visualization.
So this
Yeah.
is like a JPEG, and this would be like what was this created in that allows it to be readable?
I think it should be something like a CSV, although the journal, I think, yeah, the journal asked us to send them a CSV as an Excel file,
Mhm.
and then they converted that into, I don't know what happens at the back end, but they must have used something. But because it's the underlying format is a comma separated value file, it's easier for screen readers to read it.
Yeah. Yeah, I hadn't noticed that. But that's really good. And it's nice that the journal was willing to work with you on that because sometimes journals just want as tight as possible. And so they're going to read the discussion. They're going to talk about this. Um, the kind of last area I wanted to talk to you about before we talk a little bit about AI is um, when you write your conclusions.
Right.
I'm terrible. I can't end anything. Like I have like 100 started novel ideas and no finished. So when you get down to this last part and you're talking to the audience really directly is what I feel like, to tell them not only what you've done, but what could be done. What out of all this stuff, you have all this data, you get the charts, the graphs, and you have the sources. How do you kind of narrow it down to, okay, this is the takeaway. These are the 2 or 3 things. And I kind of have this running joke that you can always say more research needs to be done, kind of thing. But you're not doing generalizable research here, so you can't say, this causes this. You're saying here's kind of some broad patterns. So how did you translate your data and that information you got into these final kind of takeaways? What were you thinking about as you did that?
I think, yeah, it's the conclusions are things that I also struggle with because my tired brain at that point is like, hey, I've said everything I wanted to say. Please now understand what you need to understand. But no, so I think I always go back to my rhetorical training and to write the conclusion, I'm thinking about who am I imagining my readers to be and not thinking about them metaphorically, but actually visualizing like, hey, I'm thinking that teachers, scholars, teacher scholars, people who are interested in education and AI, they're the ones who are going to be reading this. And we've just kind of spoken about how the public discourse around digital writing technologies really shapes our uptake and our psychology about them. And they have this understanding of this methodology that we did. Okay, now what do I imagine those people can do with this information in their lives? What kind of roles do they perform in their occupations, or what do they do? And what would be the ideal audience? Like, what would I love if people take this information? What should they be doing? And the conclusion becomes a kind of a space to reflect or imagine those scenarios for me. So, here, for example, we imagined some ways in which teachers who want to teach critical AI literacy might adapt this activity inside their classrooms, because it's not generalizable research. As you said, we're not claiming that this table is producing like final results. This is all the metaphors, this is all they can be. This is just our version of it. So we're kind of passing on the methodology to teachers and saying, hey, you could perhaps use some of this. And after the teachers or the educators, our larger audience is always the public. And we're kind of intending that the public, if it accesses this research, perhaps develops a little more critical awareness of how metaphors in the media about all sorts of things kind of influence our behavior, while also laying out, as you said, hey, there are limitations, hey, we'll continue doing this work, and those kind of usual notes.
So if a reader were just to read, and not that I would ever do this, but just read your conclusion, which is another strategy I may or may not employ when I've got a ton of research, they could get kind of the real simple breakdown of your what you're talking about and what they could do with it. So I mean that itself, just like the abstract, is really or an executive summary is a document that is almost designed as a separate
Yeah,
readable chunk for those readers who are not going to read the whole thing.
exactly. Like that's what these documents are designed to be skimmable, right? So if you don't have time, just read the abstract. If you have a little more time, read the abstract and the conclusion. If you have more time, skim through the mid bits. If you're a grad student who has nothing to do in life, then sit down and read everything and underline it.
And I remember when I went to my PhD program, like I felt fairly competent at reading, and then I got the first week's worth of reading, and it was literally like I think there were three required books that week, and another
Wow.
15 recommended articles that we later learned were not recommended. You needed to be able to that's what she meant by recommended. And it was like a 19-page syllabus with all these readings. I almost dropped out like immediately, but yeah, that's where I learned it. I'm like, there is no human way I can get through 3 books and 15 articles in a week. Even though
One of my professors.
I had a fellowship, I wasn't teaching, I wasn't working. All I did all the time was read. I didn't have kids then, and
Yeah.
there's no way I could get through it.
One of my professors, Chris Tardy, answered this beautifully. I asked her the same question the first year of my grad school, and she said, all the readings that you're coming across during grad school in your classes or outside, they are literally meant to be indexed and not read. They're meant to create, you're meant to create a library through them. Literally just store them in your Zotero so that you should know what reading is about what, rather than everything about each of the readings, so that when a situation arises when you're looking for something about that particular thing, you know that, okay, I have these 3 or 4 things that I can take a look at. And so, yeah, just following this breadth method and depth method. Some things you just follow and kind of develop breadth. Some things which are your core interests, you dive deep into.
Yep, perfectly said. So, unlike what we've been talking about today, students, you will be reading the entire article next week and doing some annotations with it that demonstrate that you um, have kind of thought through and processed this method, and that you can identify different pieces of that method in this particular article. So, I have one last question before I want to wrap this up and let you get back to your life. And it's a very general question, and I expect a very specific answer. I'm just kidding. So a lot of our students are worried about becoming technical writers in this era of AI. And we have a lot of questions, especially at the undergrad level, not so much at the grad level, because we're doing a little bit more pointed, specific things. But I think part of it is fear, but part of it is just it's moving so fast. Like we can't prepare students like we did way back in the olden days of card catalogs, where you had time to think about, it's like this class I'm working week to week because new stuff comes out. Like we just got a new AI for our library database system. So I threw it in this week and said, all right, use this one because we just got it. We get 2 weeks to give feedback. And so how do you look at it? Like, how do you look at it as coming out of grad school with a specialization in AI? What can students do to prepare without being completely overwhelmed by this kind of mushroom explosion of things that are happening around AI? Like, what are some concrete things they should know as a result of their studies that will help them be versed in AI, but not necessarily experts at AI? Like, what are kind of the basics? I mean, other than the definitions, we talked about the different kinds of AI. So what are some other things that they could know or learn or look at?
I think the very first thing is honestly admitting and understanding that nobody knows. Anybody who gives you a list of 3 things is probably lying or trying to sell you something. Um, so the important thing is that because nobody knows, this is both scary but also presents an opportunity, because we can all make the meanings that make most sense to us. Um, so that is the larger philosophical takeaway that I'd like to give your students in terms of specific steps that have worked for me, is to try to find certain aggregations of the larger discourse of AI that are useful for the kind of jobs or the kind of things that you want to enter into. So, for example, because I want to be a scholar in writing studies, I know that there are certain scholars who have been talking about this. So, I'm engaging with their scholarship and I'm following some of those discourses on social media. And social media is really kind of, that's how you and I have kind of connected also in a way, right? So those algorithms, for example, there are newsletters I forget the name of one that I read, but it basically summarizes the most important research papers. For example, I'm interested in prompt engineering and prompt writing. So there's a person, Elvis Saravia, on Twitter, who on X, who every week kind of summarizes what are the top papers in computer science journals that came up about this. So I know that if I at least read his tweets, I'll kind of know like what's happening, what's going on. So the first concrete thing is find the best aggregator of knowledge in your specific small area that you think you want to kind of grow in. So, for example, for technical communicators who want to think about AI, find something about technical communication and its interaction with AI that would be interesting. The second thing is also learn to take a step back and breathe, because I've been following this for the last 2 years for my dissertation, and I know how burnt out and overwhelmed I am because this discourse is, as you rightly said, it's speeding up and it's going so crazy. It's not possible for human brains to process this. What's egging it on is like really, really kind of high octane capitalist competition between the big companies, each of which want to have the best tool out without thinking about what it's going to do to the public.
Mm-hmm.
So realize that maybe I don't need to be driven by their rhythms completely. And third thing would be what all good learning involves, to have more metacognitive ability to flexibly adapt to any new rhetorical situation that comes your way. Uh, Anybody who says that, hey, here is a human writing skill that AI can't do, my personal opinion is they will probably be proven wrong eventually, because that is what happens. What they're doing now is completely unimaginable. So instead of putting our bets in that here is a skill that I can learn that nobody will ever be able to automate, let's rather shift to other core areas of writing studies that we actually have a lot of strength in, which is metacognitive learning, reflection, ability to adapt to new situations. So those are the 3 4 things that I think could be helpful. Having said all of this, it's also really, really important to um, take a critical stance and see where your values align. Like, as you might have seen, like, thankfully now a lot of writing studies scholars are also coming out in the open and talking about, hey, these tools are really harmful, they can kill our environment, they're exploiting laborers, they're taking away copyrighted works, and all those things are happening. So let's say you are somebody whose ethical values tell you that you don't want to use these tools at all, then maybe what you would do is not these 3 or 4 steps, but try and imagine I am a technical writer in a future work situation where my manager maybe expects me to use this AI tool. What kind of rhetorical strategies can I use to say no in those situations and kind of
Mm-hmm.
take a principled stance? So yeah, these are some of the things. I know they aren't as concrete and as specific as you'd like to be, but yeah.
Oh no, that's perfect, because one of the things we talk about, especially in our final classes, our capstone classes, is how you talk about yourself as a tech writer. Like, people don't even know what that is, or people don't know what a content developer is. So you have to be able, almost like, to be on, not defensive, but able to articulate your worth based on what you know, because the greater world doesn't have any idea what technical writers are. So thank you so much. And I just need you to make a statement that I have not fed you any of these answers, because students are going to be like, this is what she's been saying. He's just telling. So just say, these are all my own individual answers. We have not given you a teleprompter or anything.
This is just to let you know that I'm actually an AI and all these answers were generated by prompting ChatGPT. So I'm kidding. So I'm a real human being. I'm actually a very, very tired and busy graduate student. So I
Oh,
had no time to prepare. No, I'm not saying that to,
no, I know. Yeah.
but like I had no time to prepare. So this is honestly a very natural and real conversation about just my experiences, and I'm actually very grateful for this opportunity to think through my work. I'm really grateful to Heidi for actually thinking that my work could be useful enough for you all. And I also want to say you all are super lucky, because what Heidi is doing, the kind of really innovative course that you're getting to learn from, not many people are doing that right now. So you're really accessing cutting edge knowledge. So good for you.
Oh, well, thank you. And I laughed because when I originally mapped out this discussion, my first question was going to be, you seem to know a lot about this subject. Are you actually a bot? And at the end, you said it. I'm not. So I'm like, I didn't have to ask that question. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.